Chapter 1. A Bad Start. I'm here, in Norwich. Goodbye to my job in Jack's Cafe in London for 6 days. I feel very, very happy. I want to laugh and shout, and tell everyone about it. I'm going to be in a film with Fabio Fuseli. Yes, me, Sophia Reynolds, with Fabio Fuseli. I love Fabio's films. And now I'm going to be in a film with him. Okay, it isn't just Fabio and me in the film. There are going to be lots of people. And I'm an extra. I'm not going to speak, but I'm going to be in the film. With Fabio Fuseli. It's 8 o'clock. I must be at Chapelfield Park at 10 o'clock. I have 2 hours. First I can take my bag to my hotel. I start to walk, but a woman stops me. Excuse me. Can you tell me how to get to Bank Street? She asks. I smile at the woman. I don't know Norwich, but I've got a map, I tell her. Thank you, says the woman. The map is big and it's a windy day. My hair is over my face and I can't see. I try to find Bank Street. But the wind takes the map from my hands. Oh! I start to laugh. The woman tries to help, but the wind is taking my map away. Come back here. I shout and I run down the street after the map. The map goes under a bus. I wait for the bus to stop. Then I go and get the map. I walk back up the street, but I can't see the woman. I look for her up and down the street. That's funny, I think. I put the map back in my bag. Then I see that something's wrong. These aren't my things. I say. This isn't my bag. Oh no, she's got my bag. I look up and down the street again, but the woman isn't there. I don't know what to do. Everything's going wrong. First the map, now my bag. Then I see something, a police station. I take the woman's bag and start to run. I run to the police station, and I go in. My bag. I shout at a policeman behind the desk. She's got my bag. You must help me. Please. Chapter 2. Beautiful Eyes. The policeman doesn't look up at me. He's writing something. Sit down please, miss, he says. I don't want to sit down. I want him to run into the street with me. I want him to help me. You don't understand. I say. That bag's got all my things in it. The policeman looks up at me. I see he has beautiful, dark eyes. Not like Fabio's eyes, of course. But they are beautiful. What? Why am I thinking about this man's eyes? That woman's got my bag. All these people are waiting, miss, the policeman tells me. Please sit down. I look behind me. There are 3 or 4 people waiting. They all want to speak to the policeman too. But I must be at work by 10 o'clock. I try again, but the policeman just looks at me. Please, miss, he says. I know, I say. Sit down. I go and sit down. And I wait. And wait. After 30 minutes, the policeman asks me to go over. Sit down, please, he tells me. I sit. Name, he asks. Sophia Reynolds. He writes it down. And how can we help you? I tell him about the woman and our bags. Now she's got my bag and I've got hers. I say, and I give him the woman's bag. He takes the bag from me and opens it. There's no name in here, he says. We don't know how to find the woman. What can we do? I ask. The policeman puts the bag down. You must leave it here, he says. Now, tell me what's in your bag, he says. I tell him and he writes it all down. Okay, Miss Reynolds, he says. We must wait for the woman to come in. Come back this afternoon. Or phone us. He writes the phone number down and gives it to me. Give me your number too, he says. I give him my number and get up. Thank you, I say. Goodbye. Goodbye, Miss Reynolds, he says, and then he looks away from me. Next please, he calls. A man comes over. Sit down, please, the policeman says. Mr. Sit Down, I think. That's a good name for you. Chapter 3. Mr. Sit Down. Out in the street I look for Chapelfield Park on my map. Good, it's not far. I can get there by 10 o'clock. I start to walk. Then I hear something and look down. A small boy is next to me. He looks about 3 or 4. And he's crying. Hello, I say. Where's your mother? The boy doesn't answer. He just cries. I take his hand. Don't cry, I say. I look up and down the street, but I can't see the boy's mother. I know what to do. I smile at the boy. Come on, I say. Come and see Mr. Sit Down with me. He's a policeman. The boy walks with me down the street. He doesn't stop crying. We go into the police station, and everyone looks at us. The boy is crying loudly. My policeman is speaking to a woman at his desk. I take the boy over to the desk and the policeman looks up. Miss Reynolds, the policeman says. I speak fast. This boy can't find his mother, I tell him. Excuse me, the policeman says to the woman at his desk. He gets up and comes over to the boy. His face is kind. What's your name? He asks the boy. The boy stops crying. Peter, he says. Then he looks at the policeman. Are you Mr. Sit Down? He asks. Oh help. I think. The policeman looks at me. His eyes are smiling. I want to die. I'm PC George Cooper, he tells the boy. George, I think. His name's George. Then a woman runs into the police station. Peter, she shouts. Peter. She runs over to the boy. Peter starts crying again. Mummy, he says. George gets up. He smiles at me. I smile too. Everyone is happy. Thank you for your help, Miss Reynolds, George says. Excuse me, says the woman at George's desk. I must be at work in 10 minutes. Work? The film. I'm going to be late. Goodbye, I say to George. See you this afternoon. And I run out of the police station. Chapter 4. Two Angry Men. I wait to go across the street. There are lots of cars. I start to think about Fabio Fuseli. Is he in Chapelfield Park now? There's a red car coming very fast. The car in front of it stops, and the fast red car drives into it. Crash! I run over to the front car. The window is open. Are you okay? I ask the man in the car. My new car, the man says. He gets out. He looks at his car. Then he goes over to the red car behind. He starts to shout at the man in the red car. Look at my car. The man in the red car gets out. He looks angry too. Look at my car, he says. I look at them. Oh no. I don't want to go into the police station again. I can't go in there again. But the men are shouting now. People are stopping and looking. Why don't they go into the police station for help? But they don't. So I go. George is at his desk. Miss Reynolds, he says. Please come, I say. There's going to be a fight. George gets up quickly and comes with me. There's a lot of noise out in the street. The two men are fighting now. I don't like it. They are big men and they are very angry. George runs over. I watch George at work. I don't know why, but I think about Fabio Fuseli in his film Bad Men Die. Fabio Fuseli. The film. I must get to Chapelfield Park now. I leave George with the angry men and run up the street. Chapter 5. Shouting for Fabio. I get to Chapelfield Park at 9:59. I'm not late, but I don't look good. Because of the wind, my hair is everywhere. It is a bad hair day. But by 10:30, I don't look like Sophia Reynolds. Beautiful Young Things is a 1960s film, and all the extras have 1960s hair. From bad hair day to big hair day. I think. In the film Fabio Fuseli is a famous singer, Ricky Burns. All the extras are going to watch him sing. I can't believe it. In a minute I'm going to see Fabio Fuseli. Okay, says the film director. You're all here to see the famous Ricky Burns. You love Ricky Burns. And any minute he's going to be here. I want you all to shout for Ricky. Okay. Everyone starts to shout. Ricky. Ricky. Then a man comes over. He's tall with dark hair and beautiful eyes. Fabio. I start to shout. Fabio. Stop, says the film director. Shout out for Ricky, not Fabio, please, the director says. Oh no. I think. Sorry, Fabio, the film director says to the tall man with dark hair. Fabio Fuseli's eyes look cold. That's funny, I think, they never look cold in his films. He walks away again. Okay, says the film director, and we start to shout again. This time I shout out, Ricky. We shout and shout and shout. After 30 minutes I can't talk because of all the shouting. Okay, says the film director to us. We're going to stop for 10 minutes and have a drink. I have a drink and then I go to find my phone. I want to phone George about my bag. But I've got a text from him. He's got my bag. Okay, everyone. I hear the director shout. I put my phone away and run out. Crash! I run into a man. It's Fabio Faselli. Why don't you look where you're going? Fabio shouts at me. Look at my trousers. Sorry, I start to say. But Fabio doesn't stop to listen. I watch him go. You have beautiful eyes, I think, but you're not a beautiful man. Then I think about another man's eyes. Dark eyes. P.C. George Cooper's eyes. Chapter 6. A George Cooper film. We stop work at 5 o'clock. What a day. I feel very tired. I walk slowly to the police station to get my bag. Next to the police station, a man speaks to me. Miss Reynolds. Is that you? I look up and see a man on a big motorbike. It's George. I smile and go up to him. Thank you for your text, I say. He smiles at me. He looks very good in black on his motorbike. I'm just doing my job, Miss Reynolds. He's looking at my hair. Is that why he's smiling like that? Or does he like me? Please call me Sophia, I tell him. Well, thank you for your help today, Sophia, he says. He looks at my hair again. Your hair is very big this evening, he says. I laugh. Yes, I say. I'm having a big hair day. They are making a film in Chapelfield Park. I'm an extra in it. You're going to be famous then, he asks. I think about Fabio Faselli and his cold eyes. But George is smiling at me and I don't feel sad. No, I say, I'm not going to be famous. George looks at me. Are you going to get your bag? He asks. Yes, I say, but I don't want to walk away from him. I don't want him to go. Does he know what I'm thinking? Do you want to go for a drink? He asks. Get your bag first. I can wait for you. I smile a very big smile. Yes, I say. Yes, please. Good, he says. We don't just have a drink. We talk and we laugh a lot. And he kisses me. It feels like a film, when the boy gets the girl. Only this isn't a Fabio Faselli film, it's a George Cooper film. George Cooper films are very good.
LetsTalk. Chapter 7. Mrs. Smith Tells All. The next day, Anne went to visit Mrs. Smith. She was glad to get out of the house. She did not want to see Mr. Elliot, and he was sure to visit Sir Walter.
My friend tells me that Mr. Elliot is often at your house,
said Mrs. Smith, when they were sitting in her small room drinking tea.
Who is your friend?
Asked Anne.
Mrs. Rook. She's a nurse and she works for Colonel Wallace. You know his wife has just had a baby.
Yes, and Colonel Wallace is Mr. Elliot's friend. Do you know Mr. Elliot?
I used to know him very well,
said Mrs. Smith.
but I haven't seen him for 3 years now.
Did you ever talk about me to him?
Asked Anne.
Yes, I did. I often spoke about your fine character, your modesty and intelligence. It was at the time when he met your father and sister before his marriage. Speaking of marriage, Mrs. Rook tells me that Mrs. Wallace thinks you will marry Mr. Elliot.
Well,
said Anne,
Mrs. Wallace is mistaken. Mr. Elliot hasn't asked me to marry him, and if he did, I would refuse him.
I'm glad to hear you're not engaged to him. You don't know his real character.
Please tell me about it. I've often wondered what he was like when he was young.
Mrs. Smith looked at Anne with a serious expression on her face.
Mr. Elliot is a man without heart or conscience,
She said angrily.
He thinks only of himself. My husband was his close friend before we were married, and after our marriage I became his friend too. I thought he was a fine young gentleman then. I remember when he met your father and sister, and they invited him to Kellynch. He spent the evening with us afterwards and told us the whole story. He laughed at your father and said he knew that Sir Walter wanted him to marry his daughter, but he had no money and he wanted to marry a rich woman. He knew that he would get Kellynch Hall and the title anyway, even if he didn't marry Elizabeth. At that time, he didn't care at all about the honour of his family. He once said that if titles could be sold, he would sell his for £50.
Anne was shocked and angry.
But why has he been so friendly to us since he came to Bath?
She asked.
Ah, well, people change, you see. That was years ago when he was a young man. Now he cares a lot about the family honour and the title. Colonel Wallis told him that Mrs. Clay was staying with your sister and that she was trying to make Sir Walter fall in love with her.
How do you know? You said you haven't spoken to him for 3 years.
Mrs. Rook again,
Replied Mrs. Smith.
You see, Colonel Wallis tells his wife everything, and Mrs. Wallis tells her nurse everything, and Mrs. Rook very kindly told me. She said that when Mr. Elliot heard about Mrs. Clay, he decided to make friends with Sir Walter and separate him from Mrs. Clay. He has spoken to Mrs. Clay in private and warned her not to try to win Sir Walter's affections. Mrs. Clay is afraid of him and doesn't want to spend a lot of time with Sir Walter while Mr. Elliot is present, and so he spends as much time as possible with Sir Walter. You see, Mr. Elliot is afraid that Sir Walter might marry her and have a son. Then he wouldn't inherit Kellynch Hall.
This is terrible,
Said Anne.
Yes.
Said Mrs. Smith.
As I said, he's a heartless man. But for me the clearest example of it is the way he treated my poor husband, and the way he has treated me since my husband died. After his marriage, Mr. Elliot was very rich. My husband was never good at managing money, and he was getting into serious financial difficulties. Mr. Elliot did nothing to help him. Before my husband died, he had made Mr. Elliot the executor of his will. If Mr. Elliot had tried a bit harder and invested a little of his own money, my husband's property in the West Indies would now be mine. But he did nothing, and now the bank owns the property. So you see, it's Mr. Elliot's fault that I'm so poor. I've written him several letters asking him for help, but he always refuses. Here are some of the letters I've received from him.
Mrs. Smith handed Anne a packet of letters. As she read them, Anne felt more and more angry. Each letter showed coldness and hard-hearted indifference. As she walked home, Anne thought about her conversation with Mrs. Smith. She wanted to tell her family immediately, but she knew that they would not listen to her. She decided that she would tell Lady Russell and ask her advice. The idea of Mr. Elliot's interest in her now filled her with disgust. At least he was going to be away at Thornbury for 2 days, and she would not have to talk to him. She shivered at the thought that Lady Russell might have persuaded her to marry him. Then she would have discovered his true character when it was too late. When she got home, she found Charles and Mary there. They had come to Bath for a few days with Captain Harville, Henrietta, and Mrs. Musgrove. They were all staying at the White Hart Inn. Anne was surprised and really glad to see them. Before she left, Mary turned to Anne and said,
You must come and spend the day with us at the inn tomorrow. We have so much to talk about, and Mrs. Musgrove and Henrietta want to tell you all about the wedding plans.
The next morning, Anne went to the White Hart. Captain Wentworth was there, visiting his friend Captain Harville. Anne tried to be calm.
If he still loves me, and I still love him, which I certainly do,
she thought.
surely we'll understand each other before long.
Anne!
Cried Mary, who was standing by the window.
Come and look. There's Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot.
It can't be.
Said Anne, going to the window.
He's in Thornbury until tomorrow evening.
Captain Wentworth was looking at her, and she felt sorry that she had spoken. She turned and looked out of the window. It really was Mr. Elliot. In order to correct any wrong impression her words might have given Captain Wentworth, she said,
Oh, it is him. I must have been mistaken. I wasn't listening very closely when he spoke about his plans.
Charles went up to Mrs. Musgrove and said,
Mother, I have a surprise for you. I have taken a box at the theatre for tomorrow night. I know you love the theatre. There's space for 9 people. Captain Wentworth says he'll come, and I know Anne likes the theatre. We all do.
Charles!
cried Mary.
You've forgotten that my father is giving a party tomorrow night, and we're all invited. Lady Dalrymple will be there, and Mr. Elliot, my father's heir. Surely you want to meet him?
Why should I?
Said Charles.
Mr. Elliot is nothing to me.
Captain Wentworth had been listening intently to this conversation. At this last remark, Captain Wentworth's eyes moved from Charles to Anne. Then Mrs. Musgrove said to Charles,
You'd better go back to the theatre and change the box to Tuesday night. If there's a party at her father's house, Anne will have to go to it, and we don't want to go to the theatre without Anne.
I'd much prefer to go to the theatre than stay home for my father's party.
said Anne.
But perhaps it would be best to go on Tuesday instead.
Captain Wentworth came over and sat by Anne.
Don't you like parties?
He asked.
No.
She replied.
I remember you didn't used to like them, but people change over time.
I haven't changed much.
Said Anne, hoping to suggest to him that her love was unchanged. But then she realized he might think she meant the opposite, that she would still refuse to marry him. She fell silent and blushed in confusion.
8.5 years is a very long time,
he said. Just then the door opened and Sir Walter, Elizabeth and Mrs. Clay came in.
We've come with invitations to our party,
said Elizabeth, and she handed an invitation to everyone there, including Captain Wentworth. Captain Wentworth thanked her, but did not say whether he would come to the party. After they had left, he stood staring at the invitation in confusion. Anne understood him. He could not accept the invitation as an apology for all their insulting behaviour in the past. That evening at home, she thought about these things a lot. Would Captain Wentworth come to the party? She had no idea. Turning to Mrs. Clay, she said,
I saw you talking to Mr. Elliot in the street today. I had thought he was in Thornbury.
Oh, yes, I forgot to tell you,
said Mrs. Clay.
I was surprised to see him too. He told me why he hadn't yet left for Thornbury, but I forget what he said. I wasn't really listening. I remember he said that he would definitely be back in time for the party tomorrow.
Chapter 8. A Conversation with Captain Harville. Anne spent the next day with her friends at the White Hart Inn. Captain Wentworth was there too. He asked if he could write a letter. Mrs. Musgrove showed him the writing table and brought him pen and paper. Captain Harville, who was standing by the window not far away from Captain Wentworth's table, smiled at Anne. She went and stood by him. He was holding a small painting, and he showed it to her.
Do you know who that is?
He asked.
Certainly. It's Captain Benwick.
Yes, and he's giving it to Miss Louisa Musgrove. But it wasn't painted for her. He had it done for my poor sister, and now he has asked me to bring it to Bath. He wants to have it framed so that he can give it to another woman. Captain Wentworth is writing to him now to tell him when it will be ready. I'm glad that Benwick has found someone else, but poor Fanny,
he said with strong emotion.
She wouldn't have forgotten him so quickly.
No,
said Anne.
I don't think any woman who has truly loved can forget. We don't forget you as soon as you forget us. We live at home, quietly, with nothing to distract us from our feelings. You always have business of some sort to take you back into the world immediately. Your lives are filled with activity, and so it's easier for you to forget.
But Benwick has not been busy out in the world,
said Captain Harville.
He's been living very quietly with us.
True,
said Anne.
Well, if it isn't the result of the differences between men's and women's lives, it must be the differences between their natures.
No, no. I don't think it's more in man's nature than in woman's to forget about love. I believe the opposite. Our bodies are stronger than yours, and so are our feelings.
Your feelings may be stronger,
said Anne,
but ours are more tender. I too will make a comparison between the mind and the body. Man is more robust than woman, but he doesn't live longer.
They were interrupted by the sound of Captain Wentworth's pen falling to the floor. Captain Harville turned to him and asked,
Have you finished your letter?
Perhaps I will,
said Anne with a smile.
It's easier for men to tell their own story. They're much better educated than we are. No, books prove nothing. We can only speak from our own experience.
Well, in my experience, men suffer a great deal in love. When a sailor goes to sea, leaving his wife and children behind, wondering if he'll ever see them again, he suffers greatly. Then he thinks of them every day until he returns.
Oh,
cried Anne.
I'm sure that's true. I didn't mean to suggest that only women are capable of true love and loyalty. I only meant to say that men forget more easily when the object of their love has gone. But women go on loving even when there is no hope.
She stopped speaking because she felt too much emotion to continue. Captain Wentworth stood up and said to his friend,
I've finished. We can go now.
Captain Harville said goodbye to Anne and went off to say goodbye to Mrs. Musgrove. Captain Wentworth looked at her with strong emotion in his eyes. There were 2 letters in his hand. He gave her one of them quickly, so that no one else would see. Then he was gone. Anne looked down at the letter. Her name was written on the envelope. Her heart beat fast. Her whole happiness depended on the contents of that letter. She sat down at the writing desk, opened the letter with a trembling hand, and read the following words.
I cannot listen in silence any more. Listening to you, I feel both pain and hope. Tell me that I am not too late. I offer myself to you again. I love you even more than I did 8.5 years ago, when you broke my heart. Please do not believe that man forgets about love sooner than woman. I have loved no one else. I was angry with you, and I could not forgive you, but I was never inconstant. I came to Bath because you were here. I think about nothing but you. Have you not noticed? Do you not see that I love you? I did not tell you my feelings earlier because I was afraid you did not love me any more. Please believe that I have always loved you, and I always will. I have to go now, but I will come back as soon as possible. A word, a look from you will be enough to tell me whether I enter your father's house this evening or never. Frederick Wentworth.
Anne put the letter down with tears in her eyes. She had to get out of this room, out of the inn, and away from other people. She went to Mrs. Musgrove and said,
"I'm afraid I must go home now."
Are you ill? You look very pale.
Then Charles came up to Mrs. Musgrove and said he had to go out.
I have an appointment. It won't take long. I'll be back in half an hour.
All right.
Said Mrs. Musgrove.
But, Charles, will you please take Anne home first? She's feeling ill.
Certainly,
said Charles, and they left. Chapter 9. Union Street. Anne could not feel angry with Charles or Mrs. Musgrove. They were both so kind. But she felt frustrated. She wanted to be alone. She wanted, above all, to find Captain Wentworth and talk to him. When they were walking up Union Street, Captain Wentworth saw them and crossed the street to walk with them. He looked at Anne nervously. She blushed and looked at him with an expression she hoped would show her true feelings.
"Ah, Captain Wentworth,"
said Charles.
"are you going towards Anne's house? She's not feeling well and must go home. I have an appointment in 5 minutes. Could you please walk her home?" "Of course,"
said Captain Wentworth. Charles said goodbye and left them. Anne and Frederick walked on together slowly. They were surrounded by people on the busy street, but they did not notice them. Soon they had expressed again all those feelings of love which, 8.5 years earlier, had made their future seem so secure. Now they were older, wiser, and stronger than they had been then, and their love was based on a fuller knowledge of each other's character.
"I never loved Louisa Musgrove,"
he said.
"I tried to like her, and was thinking of marrying her, because I wanted to marry. I wanted to have children and a home, and I was too angry and proud to ask you again. I had thought for years that you were too weak, too easily persuaded by other people. But in Lyme I saw the dangers of the opposite, a character that would not be persuaded at all. I began to realize your true excellence when Louisa had her accident. You were so strong, so capable, so fine. I realized then that your character is the perfect balance of strength and gentleness. But by that point, people thought that Louisa and I would get married. Perhaps even she thought so. I felt that the only honourable thing to do would be to marry her if she wanted me. In the hope that she would forget me, I went to stay with my brother in Shropshire, feeling lost and depressed. Then Harville wrote to me and told me that Louisa was engaged to Benwick. I came immediately to Bath to find you, but then I saw you with Mr. Elliot. Everyone in Bath was sure that you would marry him, and I was afraid that Lady Russell would persuade you to do so."
They had reached her house. They said goodbye, and Anne ran up to her room, feeling happier than she had ever felt before. The evening came and the guests arrived. Anne's happiness made her cheeks pink and her eyes bright. She looked lovely as she moved through the rooms, talking to the guests. Lady Dalrymple and Mr. Elliot were there, but she did not care. No one could affect her happiness. She did not mind the snobbish, irritating things her father and Elizabeth said. She did not mind Mrs. Clay standing by her father's side. She talked to Mrs. Musgrove and the Crofts and Captain Harville. She tried to talk to Lady Russell, but found it impossible. Sometimes Captain Wentworth came and talked to her. Sometimes she saw him across the room talking to someone else, but looking at her. At one point, they stood side by side, pretending to admire the plants.
"I've been thinking about the past,"
said Anne,
"and trying to decide if I was right or wrong to follow my friend's advice. I think I was right. I don't mean that I think her advice was good. She was too prudent, and I would never give such advice to a young person now. But I think I was right to do as she advised. She said that if we married, we would be poor, and we would both be miserable. If I had married you then, I would have felt guilty. I would have felt that I was the cause of any financial worries you might have in the years ahead. Now I have nothing to feel guilty about. I hope one day you will be able to forgive Lady Russell and to like her more than you do now.
Captain Wentworth looked across the room at Lady Russell.
Maybe, one day,
He said.
I too have been thinking, and I've decided that one person was more my enemy than Lady Russell, and that person was myself. Tell me, if I had come to you 2 years later, in 1808, with a few £1,000, would you have married me then?
Oh, yes.
Good God!
He cried.
I was such a fool. I wanted to do it, but I was too proud to ask you again. I didn't understand you. I shut my eyes and refused to understand you. I ought to forgive everyone before I forgive myself. This realization is a new pain for me. I've always thought of myself as a man who works hard and gets what he deserves. Now I'll have to get used to being happier than I deserve to be.
Who can be in doubt about what followed? If two young people decide to marry, they'll probably do so, even if they have no money, have no common sense, and are completely incompatible. This may be a bad moral with which to end my story, but I believe it to be true. And, if couples like that succeed, can you doubt that Captain Wentworth and Anne Elliot, with the advantages of maturity, intelligence, and £25,000, succeeded too? Sir Walter and Elizabeth were not enthusiastic, but they did not oppose the marriage. Now that Captain Wentworth was at the top of his profession and had earned a fine fortune in the war, Sir Walter could not say that he was nobody. He was now good enough to marry the daughter of a foolish, spendthrift baronet. Anne's only real worry was for Lady Russell. She had told her friend everything that Mrs. Smith had told her about Mr. Elliot's true character. Anne knew that Lady Russell must be suffering from the knowledge that she had been wrong about both Mr. Elliot and Captain Wentworth. She had mistaken manners for character in both cases. Anne, though so much younger than Lady Russell, was a much better judge of character. But Lady Russell was a good woman, and her greatest concern was Anne's happiness. Very soon she began to feel affection for the man who had made Anne happy. Mary was very pleased about the marriage. Captain Wentworth was much richer and better looking than either Charles Hayter or Captain Benwick, so she felt that her own sister had done better than her husband's sisters, and this gave her great pleasure. Soon after Anne and Frederick announced their engagement, Mr. Elliot left Bath. Elizabeth had always believed that he was there for her, so she felt humiliated by his departure. Mr. Elliot was shocked and upset by the news of Anne's engagement. He had hoped to marry her, so that he could watch Sir Walter more closely and make sure he did not marry again. But since that plan had not worked, he made a new plan for his own comfort and pleasure. He left Bath, and Mrs. Clay left soon afterwards. She moved into a house in London, and Mr. Elliot paid the rent. He was often seen at her house, and people said that, though he had stopped Mrs. Clay from becoming the wife of Sir Walter, she might one day convince him to make her the wife of Sir William. When Frederick heard Mrs. Smith's story, and how she had helped Anne to understand what kind of man Mr. Elliot really was, he felt very friendly and grateful towards her. He became as good a friend to her as Anne was. She was their first guest when they were settled in their new home. Frederick wrote letters to the West Indies and worked hard to help Mrs. Smith to get her West Indian property back, so that Mrs. Smith finally had enough money to live a quiet, contented life. Anne and Frederick were very happy together. Anne's only worry was that a future war might take him away from her. But she was very proud to be a sailor's wife. She felt that the men of the Navy were the finest men in England.